you, Chair. And thank you to both our witnesses. It's lovely to see you again, Andrew. This is not quite what you may be used to in the United States in Senate committees, but please trust us when we say we get the work done, and we hope to see results on this study as well. And thank you, Professor Young, for being here today. So my first question is to Professor Young and then to Mr. Selee. You talked about the externalization of our borders, and there are different ways states do that. You talked about the Safe Third Country Agreement, but I wonder if you think that Canada's efforts to build capacity to register, process, and adjudicate asylum claims in Mexico, Costa Rica, and Honduras is a proxy for not doing the right things ourselves, but helping others. I just wonder, is that a stretch too far? Because I actually think it's a good thing to help other countries step up to the plate, but I wonder what you think.
Thank you, Senator Omidvar, for that question. It's a really interesting one, right? And in my research, I focus on kind of the impacts of policies that are trying to prevent people from moving. But I think you're right to point out that often there are multiple things going on. So for example, I have done some research on the Mexican context where simultaneously, Canada has implemented a visa policy that was lifted and then replaced and then lifted again, while also investing in capacity building and training in the country. I don't know if my colleague, Mr. Selee, might know more about the work under the auspices of the Anti-Crime Capacity Building Program in Mexico in terms of the actual impacts. I know that there have been RCMP and Justice Department officials over the years who have spent time through this program. And so I guess I'm not ducking the question, but I think as you're right to point out that it's complicated, right? So so I think the question is, are people actually receiving asylum who need protection and asylum through those procedures, or is the Mexican system, overwhelmed or not up to par? I think those would be questions to kind of get some more insight into from our colleague on the panel, and maybe I'll hand it over to him. That's okay.
Okay, just to answer that, Senator Omidvar, first of all, let me say that this is much more civilized than testifying in the U.S. Senate. So I actually am very pleased to be with you here. We'll talk about that later. But this is, and I'm quite convinced that you get the work done, and always very impressed by the way the Canadian government conducts itself on global issues. And I have to say, I know you guys know the upsides and the downsides, but one of the things I have to say, having worked and by the way, joining you from Mexico right now, though I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm actually in Mexico at the moment. And having followed a little bit the RCMP work in Mexico on and off through the years, I have to say it's been particularly important. Canada doesn't pack the same punch in terms of intelligence and boots on the ground as the United States, but it's much more trusted. And no offense to my colleagues in the U.S. government, but it's always a more complicated relationship with the U.S., right? I mean, it's not that it's a bad relationship. It's a good relationship in many ways. But I would say I've been in many trilateral meetings on public security issues where I've noticed how much the Canadians are seen as a trusted interlocutor. And there's quite often an interest from the Mexican government in working with the Canadians on things that are sensitive or deal with policing in particular. They go to the U.S. for intelligence, right? I mean, for other things, but in terms of thinking of systems, they trust the Canadian input quite a bit. So let me say, I think the Mexican asylum system is completely overwhelmed, and they're going through the same thing that the U.S. asylum system is, which is that they get lots of cases of people who probably don't qualify for asylum because there are a few other legal pathways, right? And so people really come into the asylum systems because that's the only thing that gives them entree. And in the case of Mexico, they're really trying to get to the United States. Mexico does have a number of people, tens of thousands now, who they have given asylum to and who have settled in Mexico. So there are people who go through the entire process and settle. But it is, a lot of their system is overwhelmed with the same thing as the US, which is people who would really prefer to be on a work-based visa or have another way of coming in to the United States, and they're taking advantage of the only legal pathway that they have, even though it might not be the right one. No, thank you.
Interesting that you talk about Canada as a trusted interlocutor, and it's a good thing to be. Do you think that we need to stride more confidently on the world stage as a trusted interlocutor on these matters?
Yes. By the way, I actually, I'm trying to think of the political way to say this, Senator. I think Canada could be far more assertive in the Western Hemisphere. I think in general on the global stage, but actually Canada is quite a player on the global stage. But I would say the Western Hemisphere, Canada is sometimes, and I apologize for being so direct, but since we know each other and you know you've invited me to speak to this commission, I hope the others will have forbearance. I think in Canada sometimes is ambivalent about its role in the Western Hemisphere, right? It is a global player. It's not just a Western Hemisphere player. The U.S. is much more directly, the U.S. is a global player, but it's much more directly affected by what happens in the Western Hemisphere. Canada has a lot of fish and the U.S. in the middle, you know, and so in some ways it doesn't, you know, get the same migration patterns and so on and so forth. But I do think Canada, when it comes to migration right now, people are really looking to Canada for leadership. I think it's not always the scale of resources. It's not always the, you know, the number of meetings. It is the wisdom, the fact that it's a less confrontational relationship. There's less history there, and people trust Canadian institutions. They also know that Canada kind of works, right? And so they would like to be. People are ambivalent about being like the U.S. They would like to be like Canada in many ways. And so I think one area where I think this is particularly important right now is, you know, the safe mobility offices and the whole effort to extend legal pathways and protection pathways in the hemisphere is being led by the U.S. Canada and Spain are kind of on board. I would love to see Canada play a bigger role in conceptualization, not just sort of taking people, but in conceptualization of this. Because I think Canada, when Canada and the US work together and work with partners in Latin America and the Caribbean, the result is often better. And actually, the quick example I'll give on that's the protection transfer arrangement, which is Canada, US, and UNHCR, as well as a lot of local NGOs, where they've been identifying people in Central America who have protection needs either before they have to flee, before they become refugees, or in the first country they get to. So people don't have to go and seek asylum 1,000 miles away, right? Or 2,000 kilometers away. It has worked brilliantly. It's worked quietly, but it's worked in part because it's a Canadian-US effort with UNHCR and with Costa Rica actually playing a pretty big role as well. And I think that partnership has been really important.
Thank you. That's
Mr. Selee.
fascinating.